John F. Kennedy, a name that still echoes through the corridors of American history, wrapped in charm, power, mystery, and tragedy. But who was the man behind the legend? In this documentary, we'll uncover the hidden layers of JFK's life, from his privileged beginnings and wartime heroism to the turbulent politics that defined his presidency and the secrets that shadowed his legacy. We'll explore the man beyond the myth, his ambitions, his struggles, and the forces that shaped one of the most iconic figures of the 20th century. So, if you're ready to discover the untold story of John F. Kennedy, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let's begin this journey through history. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born into a family that seemed destined to leave its mark on American history. From the very beginning, his life was defined by privilege, ambition, and expectation. The Kennedys were not merely a wealthy family, they were an institution in the making, a dynasty forged through power, persistence, and a relentless desire to rise above their immigrant origins. To understand John F. Kennedy, one must first understand the world he was born into, a world built by his father, Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr., whose influence would shape not only his son's destiny, but the course of American politics for decades to come. Joseph Kennedy was the son of Irish immigrants who had faced discrimination and exclusion in Boston's rigid social hierarchy. Determined to break through those barriers, Joseph devoted his life to accumulating wealth and influence. He was shrewd, calculating, and utterly fearless in business. Whether in banking, Hollywood, or the stock market, he pursued success with a singular focus: to make the name Kennedy synonymous with power. By the time John was born on May 29, 1917, in Brookline, Massachusetts, his father had already transformed the family into one of the most prosperous in New England. John, or Jack as he was affectionately called, was the second son in a brood of 9 children. In a household filled with competition, wit, and fierce ambition, there was little room for mediocrity. The Kennedys were raised to win, in school, in sports, and eventually in life. Their mother, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, the daughter of a prominent Boston politician, was devoutly Catholic and deeply disciplined. She instilled in her children a sense of duty, faith, and public service, while Joseph focused on strategy, opportunity, and control. Together, they crafted an environment where excellence wasn't encouraged, it was demanded. From a young age, Jack's life was marked by contradiction. Though he was intelligent and charming, he was also frail. Childhood illnesses, including scarlet fever and chronic back problems, often confined him to bed for weeks at a time. While his older brother, Joe Jr., embodied their father's vision of a robust future president, athletic, commanding, and seemingly invincible, Jack was the dreamer, the reader, the thinker. Yet, in those long periods of recovery, something vital began to take shape. Jack developed a quiet resilience, a reflective nature, and an early curiosity about the world beyond the walls of his home. Despite his health struggles, Kennedy's competitive spirit never wavered. He sought to keep up with his siblings, sometimes using humor and intellect as weapons where physical strength failed him. His quick wit and disarming smile became his greatest tools, earning him affection and admiration among friends and teachers alike. Beneath his boyish charm, however, there was a seriousness, a desire to understand history, human nature, and the forces that moved nations. Joseph Kennedy Sr., always the strategist, recognized that each of his children had a role to play in his grand design. For Joe Jr., it was the presidency. For Jack, it was to support the family's growing political machine. The Kennedys were not content to be spectators in America's elite circles. They intended to lead them. Their father's ambitions extended beyond wealth. He sought legitimacy, a place for the Irish Catholic family once dismissed by Boston's Brahmin elite, to sit at the very center of American power. To achieve this, Joseph carefully cultivated relationships across business and politics. He served as the first chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, later becoming U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom under Franklin D. Roosevelt. These roles elevated the Kennedys from nouveau riche outsiders to respected figures on the world stage. For young Jack, watching his father navigate corridors of power in London and Washington left an indelible impression. It exposed him to the complexities of diplomacy and the moral ambiguities of leadership. lessons he would carry into his own political life. Yet the Kennedy home was far from warm or sentimental. Joseph ruled it with the same decisiveness he used in business. His children were taught that winning wasn't everything, it was the only thing. He measured success by outcomes, not intentions, and failure was rarely tolerated. That pressure forged resilience but also left scars. Behind the family's dazzling image of unity and glamour was a relentless drive to live up to a father's impossible expectations. As Jack grew older, he began to see both the brilliance and the ruthlessness in his father's world. Joseph Kennedy's success had not come without controversy. His business dealings were often criticized for crossing ethical lines, and his sympathies toward appeasement before World War II cast a shadow on his reputation. For Jack, this duality of idealism and pragmatism, of vision and moral compromise, became a central theme of his life. He admired his father's intellect and audacity, but sought to define himself in a different way, through ideas, integrity, and the pursuit of something greater than ambition alone. By the time Jack reached adolescence, the Kennedys had become America's unofficial royal family, admired, envied, and closely watched. Yet, beneath the polish, the young man who would one day inspire a nation was still searching for his place within his family's empire. While Joe Jr. prepared for a path carefully laid out for him, Jack's destiny remained uncertain. No one could yet imagine that the sickly, introspective boy in his brother's shadow would one day rise to become the face of a new generation and the symbol of hope for an entire nation. When John F. Kennedy entered Harvard University in the fall of 1936, he carried with him both privilege and pain. His last name already opened doors, but his frail health and self-doubt often made him feel like an outsider among the sons of America's elite. At first, college life seemed less a mission than an escape, a chance to define himself apart from the towering shadow of his father and his older brother, Joe Jr. But the world around him was changing, and so was he. Within those ivy-covered walls, the young Kennedy began a journey that would sharpen his intellect, deepen his curiosity, and awaken his political consciousness. Harvard in the 1930s was a world of intense debate and intellectual challenge. It was a place where young men of privilege learned to question tradition while preparing to inherit it. Jack, however, arrived more focused on sports and social life than on academic achievement. He joined the swim team, mingled effortlessly with classmates, and developed a reputation for his wit and easygoing charm. Yet behind that effortless grace was a student who spent much of his time battling illness. Persistent back pain and intestinal problems often forced him into hospitals, leaving him bedridden for weeks. Those quiet, painful stretches away from campus became turning points. Isolated from the world of youthful indulgence, Jack read voraciously. History, political theory, and biographies of great leaders filled his bedside table. He was particularly drawn to stories of courage under pressure, figures like Winston Churchill and Abraham Lincoln, men who faced adversity not through privilege, but through conviction. Slowly, he began to see that leadership was not just about ambition, but about character. Kennedy's intellectual curiosity grew rapidly during his sophomore and junior years. While Joe Jr. projected the image of the confident heir apparent, Jack developed a more reflective view of the world. He was fascinated by international relations, especially the shifting balance of power in Europe as the threat of Nazi Germany loomed. The more he read, the more he questioned his father's cautious, often isolationist worldview. Joseph Kennedy, then serving as the US ambassador to Great Britain, believed that America should avoid entanglement in Europe's troubles. Jack, however, saw the dangers of appeasement and the moral cost of inaction. In 1938, he traveled to London to visit his family, who were living there during his father's ambassadorship. It was his first close encounter with world affairs, and it left a deep impression. He observed firsthand the diplomatic circles of Europe and the growing tension as war drew near. He met politicians, journalists, and military officers who would later shape his understanding of global power. Unlike his father, who admired Britain's attempts to negotiate peace with Hitler, Jack returned to Harvard convinced that the world was on the brink of catastrophe and that democracies had a responsibility to stand firm against tyranny. That experience inspired his senior thesis, a detailed examination of Britain's unpreparedness for World War II. Titled Appeasement in Munich, it criticized the failure of Western democracies to confront Nazi aggression early on. His writing was sharp, analytical, and surprisingly mature for someone barely in his 20s. When the thesis was later published under the title Why England Slept, it became a minor bestseller. For the first time, the public saw a glimpse of the young Kennedy's intellect and voice, thoughtful, critical, and informed by moral conviction. But even as his academic star rose, Jack's health continued to decline. Years of undiagnosed Addison's disease, compounded by back injuries and infections, made every step forward a test of endurance. His friends recalled that he rarely complained, masking his pain with humor and an almost stubborn optimism. He learned to live with discomfort, to push through exhaustion and to maintain composure in moments of vulnerability. That quiet resilience, cultivated during his Harvard years, would later define his political demeanor. The calm, steady confidence that Americans came to admire. Beyond academics, Harvard exposed Kennedy to new ideas about leadership and identity. He became more aware of class, privilege, and the responsibility that came with both. Unlike many of his peers, who accepted their status as future financiers or diplomats, Jack began to see leadership as a form of service. He wasn't drawn to politics merely as a family expectation, but as a means to shape the world he had studied so intensely. Professors who once viewed him as a distracted socialite began to notice his depth. His essays revealed a mind capable of nuance, one that understood both the practical demands of power and the moral weight of decision-making. Graduating in 1940, Jack left Harvard transformed. The boy who had entered with uncertainty emerged as a man with a sense of purpose. He had found his voice not through competition with his brother, but through understanding the world's complexity and his potential place in it. He was no longer simply a Kennedy. He was John Fitzgerald Kennedy, a thinker, a writer, and soon a leader in his own right. Still, as he stood at the threshold of adulthood, the world itself was plunging into war. The ideals he had explored in his studies were about to collide with the brutal reality of global conflict. His next chapter would not unfold in lecture halls or libraries, but on the waters of the Pacific, where courage would no longer be an intellectual concept. It would become a matter of life and death. When John F. Kennedy joined the U.S. Navy in 1941, the world was already spiraling into chaos. For the son of an ambassador and millionaire, military service was not an expectation. It was a statement. He could have chosen comfort or a desk in Washington, but Jack wanted to prove himself beyond the privileges of his name. Still haunted by his fragile health and his father's skepticism, he was determined to test his limits. War, to him, was not only a duty, but an opportunity to show that courage and character could outweigh lineage and luxury. After completing officer training, Kennedy was assigned to command a small patrol torpedo boat, PT-109, stationed in the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific. These boats were fast, agile, and deadly, designed to strike Japanese ships under cover of darkness. But they were also perilous. Lightly armored and vulnerable to the elements, their missions demanded both precision and nerve. For Jack, who had grown up reading about epic battles and noble sacrifice, this was his chance to live out the ideals he admired. Yet what awaited him would test those ideals in ways he never imagined. On the night of August 1st, 1943, PT-109 was on a routine mission near the island of New Georgia. The crew, 11 young men under Kennedy ES command, scanned the black waters for signs of enemy ships. The air was thick, the sea calm, and visibility nearly non-existent. Then, out of the darkness, a Japanese destroyer, the Amagiri, appeared like a ghost, cutting through the night at high speed. Before Kennedy could react, the massive vessel slammed into PT-109, slicing it in half. The explosion hurled men and debris into the ocean. 2 of his crew were killed instantly. The rest, stunned and injured, clung to the wreckage as the fire spread across the water. Kennedy, himself thrown into the sea, surfaced to find chaos. He could have saved himself, but instead he began searching for survivors, shouting into the darkness. He pulled one wounded sailor to safety and gathered the remaining men onto a drifting piece of the hull. As dawn approached, it became clear they were stranded miles from land, surrounded by enemy patrols, with no food, little hope, and only the vast Pacific around them. What followed would become one of the most extraordinary survival stories of World War II. Kennedy, despite his chronic back pain and exhaustion, took command with calm determination. Spotting a small island in the distance, he tied a life jacket strap between his teeth, placed the most severely injured sailor on his back, and began to swim. For hours, he fought strong currents and burning pain, leading his men to safety one by one. When they finally reached the island, he collapsed from exhaustion, but immediately began planning their next move. Over the next several days, Kennedy led repeated swims through dangerous waters, searching for help. At night, he would slip into the ocean alone, navigating by starlight toward nearby islands in hopes of finding friendly forces. On one of these attempts, he encountered two Solomon Islanders working with the Allies. Using a coconut shell, he carved a rescue message. Noro ISL Commander, native knows position, he can pilot, 11 alive, need small boat, and sent it back through them. That coconut would later sit on his desk in the Oval Office, a silent reminder of the night that defined him. After 6 days, the crew of PT-109 was rescued. The men owed their survival to Kennedy's leadership, endurance, and refusal to surrender. Newspapers back home hailed him as a war hero. The story of the young lieutenant who had risked his life for his men became a sensation, carefully cultivated by Joseph Kennedy Sr., who saw in it the foundation of his son's future political career. To the public, it was a tale of bravery. To Jack, it was something far more complex and a moment of both triumph and awakening. Behind the headlines and medals, Kennedy's experience in the Pacific left him deeply scarred. He had witnessed death, fear, and the fragility of human life up close. The war stripped away the romantic notions of heroism he once admired in books. It revealed the randomness of survival, the senseless waste of youth, and the moral weight of command. Though he wore his decorations with humility, he rarely spoke of the incident in detail. Those who served under him described a man who carried the memory quietly, proud but forever changed. The physical toll was immense. His back, already damaged before the war, worsened severely. He spent months in hospitals, enduring surgeries and chronic pain that would follow him for the rest of his life. But perhaps the deeper wound was psychological. The boy who had once seen war as a proving ground now understood its true cost. In later years, this experience would shape his foreign policy instincts, his preference for negotiation over confrontation, and his deep skepticism toward military escalation. For Kennedy, the war was both the making of his legend and the seed of his disillusionment. He had proven his courage beyond doubt, but he had also seen how fragile leadership could be, how thin the line was between victory and loss. The story of PT-109 would launch his political image, the hero who led from the front, who saved others at great personal risk. Yet beneath that heroic surface, Kennedy emerged not as a man intoxicated by glory, but as one tempered by suffering. The experience gave him empathy, discipline, and a sense of realism that would distinguish him from the idealists and the cynics alike. When he returned home, the country saw a decorated veteran ready for greatness. What they could not see was the quiet man behind the smile, a man who had looked into the depths of despair and come back transformed. His next battle would not be on distant islands or open seas, but in the unpredictable arena of American politics, where courage would take on an entirely different form. When John F. Kennedy returned from the war, America was celebrating victory, but he was restless. The years of combat had left him physically weakened, yet spiritually sharpened. He had seen both courage and chaos, and now he sought meaning beyond medals and memory. Politics offered that purpose, not just as a continuation of the Kennedy ambition, but as a chance to act on what he had learned about leadership, sacrifice, and the fragility of peace. Yet his path to power would not simply depend on ideals, it would depend on image, strategy, and timing, and in each of these, the Kennedys were unmatched. In 1946, at just 29 years old, Kennedy announced his candidacy for Massachusetts' S11th Congressional District, a seat long dominated by traditional Boston politicians. At first, few took him seriously. To many, he seemed too young, too privileged, too soft-spoken for the gritty world of post-war politics. But behind the calm demeanor was a family machine ready to redefine the rules of campaigning. His father, Joseph Kennedy, orchestrated the effort with military precision. He poured resources into publicity, ensuring that every handshake, photograph, and newspaper mention built the image of a war hero dedicated to public service. Kennedy's campaign was unlike anything the district had seen. His team distributed tens of thousands of leaflets, featuring Jack's smiling face and his war record. They organized coffee meetings, parades, and personal visits in every neighborhood, blending old-fashioned retail politics with a new sense of modern style. His sisters, particularly Eunice and John, worked tirelessly on the trail, charming voters and spreading enthusiasm. His mother, Rose, organized Catholic women's groups, and his father quietly negotiated support from local power brokers. The Kennedys turned politics into theater, disciplined, elegant, and meticulously staged. But it wasn't just the machinery that made Jack stand out, it was his charisma. He had an ease with people that felt natural rather than rehearsed. In working-class neighborhoods, he listened more than he spoke, his humor and humility bridging the divide between privilege and the everyday struggles of voters. His war service gave him credibility, while his intelligence hinted at vision. He didn't shout or posture, he invited people to believe. When he won the election by a comfortable margin, it was clear that something new had entered American politics. In Congress, Kennedy's early years were marked by caution and learning. He wasn't a fiery debater or a populist crusader. Instead, he observed, studied, and built relationships quietly. He voted along moderate lines, balancing liberal ideals with pragmatic restraint. His speeches showed flashes of depth, hints of the statesman he would become, but he remained careful not to alienate the establishment. His colleagues noticed his discipline, his ability to stay composed under pressure, and his instinct for timing. Still, the drive within him was unmistakable. Kennedy was ambitious, but unlike many in Washington, his ambition carried polish and patience. By 1952, with the family's encouragement, he decided to challenge Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. for a U.S. Senate seat, a move that would test both his skill and his family's influence. Lodge was a respected Republican incumbent, a decorated veteran himself, and a member of one of Massachusetts's most prominent political families. It was a classic American duel, the old aristocracy versus the rising dynasty. Once again, the Kennedys revolutionized campaign strategy. They understood the growing power of mass media, radio, newspapers, and especially television, and used it to full advantage. Glossy ads showcased Kennedy's youthful energy and handsome face. Short documentary films about his war service played in local theaters. He appeared at universities, labor halls, and veterans events, speaking in a tone that mixed modesty with moral conviction. His sisters and brothers, now well-trained in the family's political choreography, mobilized across the state. Even his mother-s charm offensives in parishes and women-s groups became vital to the effort. Kennedy's appeal was not just generational, it was cultural. He embodied the optimism of post-war America, the belief that a new kind of leadership could replace the tired rhetoric of the past. When he defeated Lodge by a narrow but symbolic margin, it marked more than a personal victory. It signaled the arrival of a new political style, one rooted in image, intelligence, and emotional connection, rather than party machines and patronage. As a senator, Kennedy continued to refine his public persona. Behind the scenes, his health problems persisted, often forcing him into long hospital stays. Yet he never let the public see his pain. His tan complexion, crisp suits, and confident posture projected vitality. His speeches grew more sophisticated, addressing issues like Cold War strategy, economic fairness, and social responsibility. He began writing again, channeling his fascination with courage and moral conviction into his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Profiles in Courage. The work, a tribute to historical figures who had acted on principle over popularity, further cemented his reputation as an intellectual among politicians. But Kennedy's rise wasn't just about intellect or family ambition, it was about timing. America in the 1950s was ready for transformation. The nation's youth, prosperity, and anxiety in the nuclear age demanded leaders who could inspire both hope and stability. Kennedy, with his easy smile and calm eloquence, seemed to embody both. The political establishment, built on hierarchy and seniority, struggled to match his magnetism. Old guard politicians appeared stiff and outdated next to his vitality and vision. By the end of the decade, Kennedy was no longer merely the son of Joseph Kennedy or the war hero from Massachusetts. He had become a national figure, the face of a modern America, sophisticated yet approachable, idealistic yet pragmatic. His mastery of the camera and the crowd made him more than a senator. He was a symbol of what politics could be in the television age. Yet, beneath the glamour, he remained acutely aware of the fragility of success. He had seen too much loss, in war, in illness, in the quiet sacrifices hidden behind every triumph, to believe that destiny alone would carry him forward. But destiny, it seemed, was already calling. The stage was set for his next and greatest challenge, the race for the presidency, where the myth of John F. Kennedy would begin to take full form. By 1960, John F. Kennedy had transformed from a promising young senator into a national phenomenon. His charm, intellect, and cool composure made him a rising star in a political landscape hungry for renewal. America was entering a new decade, one defined by the Cold War, rapid technological change, and a restless younger generation seeking a future that looked different from the post-war conformity of the 1950s. Kennedy sensed this shift instinctively. While older politicians clung to the language of caution and stability, he offered something else, a call to action, a sense that America could still achieve greatness if it dared to dream again. His decision to run for president was bold, even audacious. At 42, he was relatively young and to many still untested. His Catholic faith was seen as a liability, stirring fears that the Vatican might influence American policy. Yet Kennedy and his team understood that the public's perception could be reshaped through discipline and media mastery. His campaign became a carefully choreographed production, a mix of charisma, messaging, and cutting-edge communication strategy that would redefine modern politics. Facing him was Vice President Richard Nixon, a seasoned and skillful politician with 8 years of national experience under the Eisenhower administration. Nixon had the resume and the backing of the Republican establishment, but Kennedy had something less tangible: presence. Where Nixon spoke to reason, Kennedy spoke to feeling. He offered not just policy, but possibility. From the beginning, the Kennedy campaign was a family enterprise, tightly run and fiercely loyal. His brother Robert, acting as campaign manager, built an organization that operated with military precision. Every appearance, every handshake, every word spoken to the press was part of a larger narrative, that Kennedy represented youth, vigor, and a new generation of leadership. His speeches blended poetry with pragmatism. He promised to get America moving again, a simple phrase that captured both frustration with the status quo and hope for renewal. But it was television that would prove to be Kennedy's most powerful ally. The 1960 presidential debates, the first ever broadcast live on national TV, became a turning point in American political history. When the candidates took the stage on September 26th, millions of viewers tuned in, unaware that they were witnessing the birth of a new political era. Nixon, pale and recovering from illness, refused makeup and appeared tense under the harsh studio lights. Kennedy, by contrast, looked confident, tanned and composed. His tailored suit, direct gaze, and calm voice radiated control. To radio listeners, the debate seemed evenly matched or even tilted slightly toward Nixon. But television viewers saw something entirely different. Kennedy appeared presidential, poised, articulate, and unflappable, while Nixon seemed defensive and fatigued. Image had triumphed over argument. Kennedy had intuitively understood what few others did at the time. In the age of television, perception was power. The medium was no longer just a window into politics, it was the stage itself. After the debates, momentum shifted decisively. Kennedy drew massive crowds wherever he went. Young people, in particular, were captivated by his energy and eloquence. His speeches fused patriotism with idealism, urging Americans to embrace a new sense of civic purpose. He spoke not only about policies, but about the moral strength of the nation, invoking the shared destiny of a country that could do better, reach higher, and serve humanity more fully. Yet the campaign was not without its battles. Anti-Catholic sentiment surfaced repeatedly, threatening to undermine his chances, especially in the South and Midwest. Kennedy confronted the issue directly. In a historic address to Protestant ministers in Houston, he declared that he believed in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute. His words disarmed critics, revealing a man whose loyalty was not to any church, but to the Constitution and the people. That moment crystallized his image as a leader, guided by conviction rather than identity. Election night on November 8, 1960, was one of the closest in American history. As votes were counted through the night, tension gripped the nation. By dawn, Kennedy had emerged victorious by a razor-thin margin. His victory was narrow in numbers, but seismic in symbolism. For the first time in generations, America had elected a president who represented youth, intellect, and modernity, a leader who embodied not just the politics of his time, but its aspirations. The inauguration on January 20th, 1961, was unlike any other. Standing before the Capitol on a crisp winter morning, Kennedy delivered a speech that would echo for decades. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. In those words, he redefined patriotism as participation, transforming national service into a personal calling. The world watched as a young, confident president, flanked by his elegant wife Jacqueline, took command of the most powerful nation on earth. The press soon coined the term Camelot to describe the Kennedy White House, a reference to the mythical kingdom of King Arthur, where youth, beauty, and idealism reigned. It was a narrative partly crafted by the media, but also one the Kennedys themselves subtly encouraged. The image of the first family, poised, cultured, and glamorous, captivated the public imagination. They represented not just a political dynasty, but an American dream reborn in the television age. Yet beneath the glow of cameras and ceremony, Kennedy understood the weight of what lay ahead. The Cold War was intensifying, racial divisions at home were deepening, and the margin of his victory left little room for error. The campaign had shown the power of perception, but the presidency would test the substance behind the image. For now, though, America believed again. The country had chosen youth over experience, vision over caution. And for a moment, in that brief, shining moment, it seemed that anything was possible. When John F. Kennedy entered the White House in January 1961, the air was thick with anticipation. To millions, he represented the dawn of a new era, young, energetic, and unafraid to challenge the old order. His administration branded itself the New Frontier, a term that captured both his ambition and the restless spirit of the 1960s. It was more than a slogan. It was a promise to explore new horizons in science, civil rights, and foreign policy, to push America beyond complacency into greatness once more. Yet beneath the poetry of his rhetoric lay the hard realities of governing in a world teetering between hope and annihilation. The Kennedy White House pulsed with vitality. It was a place where intellectuals, artists, and scientists mingled with politicians and military men. His advisors, often young, well-educated, and fiercely competitive, embodied the same confidence as their leader. Kennedy surrounded himself with what the press called the best and the brightest. They were brilliant, ambitious, and convinced that reason and expertise could solve almost any problem. But the world, Kennedy would soon learn, had a way of humbling even the most capable minds. From his first days in office, he faced the immense weight of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a global struggle not only of power, but of ideology. Every decision carried existential stakes. In April 1961, barely 3 months into his presidency, Kennedy approved a plan inherited from the Eisenhower administration, an attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist regime in Cuba using a force of CIA-trained exiles. The invasion, known as the Bay of Pigs, was a disaster. Poor planning, inadequate support, and bad intelligence led to a swift and humiliating defeat. The failure shook Kennedy to his core. Publicly, he accepted full responsibility, but privately he felt betrayed by the very experts he had trusted. The incident taught him a lesson he would never forget, that military and intelligence advice, no matter how confident, must always be questioned. Victory has 100 fathers, he said afterward, but defeat is an orphan. From that moment on, he became more skeptical, more deliberate, and far more independent in his judgment. Determined to recover from the embarrassment, Kennedy sought new ways to project strength. He increased America's commitment to the space race, declaring that the nation would land a man on the moon before the decade's end, a bold goal meant to restore confidence and challenge Soviet supremacy in science and innovation. But the world stage remained volatile. In 1961, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev tested the young president's resolve during a tense summit in Vienna. The encounter left Kennedy shaken. Khrushchev saw him as inexperienced, perhaps even weak, and soon after, construction began on the Berlin Wall, a concrete symbol of Cold War division. The real test, however, came the following year. In October 1962, US intelligence discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from American shores. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. For 13 days, Kennedy and his advisors faced the terrifying possibility of global annihilation. The military urged immediate airstrikes and invasion. Others pressed for diplomacy. Kennedy walked a perilous middle path, determined to show strength without provoking catastrophe. He ordered a naval blockade around Cuba, a quarantine, as he called it, to prevent further shipments of Soviet weapons. Then, in a televised address, he revealed the situation to the American people with calm authority, outlining both the danger and the nation's firm response. Across the world, millions held their breath. Soviet ships steamed toward the blockade line as US bombers and missiles stood ready for launch. The slightest miscalculation could have unleashed a nuclear holocaust. Throughout those tense days, Kennedy displayed a rare balance of courage and restraint. He listened carefully to conflicting advice, but he trusted his instincts. Secretly, he opened back-channel communications with Khrushchev, seeking a peaceful resolution. When the Soviet leader finally agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for a US promise not to invade Cuba and a quiet removal of American missiles from Turkey, the crisis ended without bloodshed. The world exhaled, and Kennedy emerged transformed. He was hailed as a hero, but more importantly, he had earned something rarer than victory: respect. He had resisted both fear and pride, proving that leadership was not about domination, but about understanding the limits of power. The experience deepened his humanity. In private, he spoke of the horror he felt, knowing how close the world had come to destruction. He became more committed to diplomacy, to communication, and to preventing such a moment from ever occurring again. The crisis also reshaped his presidency. It tempered his confidence with humility and gave new weight to his vision of peace. He began pursuing arms control agreements, opening dialogue with Moscow, and promoting what he called a strategy of peace. In 1963, he signed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, a milestone in US-Soviet relations and a reflection of his evolving philosophy. Inside the White House, however, the tension never fully lifted. Kennedy's health was failing, and the strain of constant crises took its toll. He hid his pain behind charm and humor, refusing to let the public see weakness. Yet those close to him noticed moments of introspection, flashes of melancholy in a man who carried the weight of the modern world on his shoulders. The new frontier had begun as a vision of exploration and progress, but by 1963, it had become something deeper, a moral frontier, testing not just the nation's strength, but its conscience. Kennedy's leadership during the Cuban Missile Crisis revealed the essence of his presidency, the blend of intellect, empathy, and restraint that made him both a statesman and a symbol. He had stared into the abyss of nuclear war and chosen humanity over hubris. Behind the image of vitality and confidence that John F. Kennedy projected to the world, there existed a far more complex, fragile reality. To the public, he appeared as the embodiment of youth and vigor, a handsome president with a radiant wife and 2 beautiful children, a man who seemed effortlessly in command of history itself. But behind the polished facade of Camelot, Kennedy's personal life was a delicate balance of charm, secrecy, and physical suffering. He lived every day in the tension between the image of invincibility he had created and the very human frailties he tried desperately to conceal. Kennedy's marriage to Jacqueline Bouvier in 1953 seemed to complete the picture of a perfect American couple. She was elegant, educated, and fluent in multiple languages, a woman who exuded sophistication, yet possessed a quiet strength that matched her husband's ambition. Together, they captivated the public imagination. Their wedding was covered like a royal event, setting the stage for the mythic aura that would later surround their years in the White House. But beneath the surface, their relationship was complicated, a union of affection, admiration, and at times, distance. Jackie understood the demands of life with a Kennedy. From the beginning, she accepted that politics was not merely her husband's career, but his identity. She admired his intellect and wit, but she also knew the emotional cost of his drive. Kennedy's relentless focus on public life left little room for intimacy. He was charming but elusive, loving yet often absent. His infidelities, whispered about in Washington long before they became public knowledge, were part of the hidden machinery of his private existence. To the world, he was a devoted husband and father. In truth, he lived with a restlessness that no single person could fully satisfy. Kennedy's affairs ranged from fleeting encounters with Hollywood actresses to long-term liaisons that blurred the lines between affection and escape. His charm was legendary, his discretion less so, yet those who knew him best often described his relationships not as expressions of power or conquest, but as attempts to find relief from the crushing pressure he endured daily. He lived in constant pain, physical and emotional, and sought distraction wherever he could find it. Jackie, aware of much of it, chose to maintain grace under the scrutiny of public life. Her dignity became her shield, her silence a kind of quiet defiance. What few knew at the time was just how sick Kennedy truly was. Throughout his adult life, he suffered from a constellation of chronic ailments: Addison's disease, severe back injuries from the war, and debilitating gastrointestinal problems. His medical records were treated as state secrets, carefully guarded to protect the image of a strong, capable leader. In reality, he depended on a complex regimen of medications, steroids, painkillers, and stimulants, administered by a small circle of trusted doctors. The toll was immense. He wore a back brace almost constantly, endured frequent hospitalizations, and lived with pain so intense that even sitting or standing could become an ordeal. Yet he never allowed that suffering to show. In public, he exuded effortless composure. The iconic image of Kennedy, tanned, confident, smiling, was an act of extraordinary control. He believed that vulnerability, especially in a leader, was something the American people could not afford to see. His humor became his armor. In press conferences, he deflected difficult questions with quick wit. In private meetings, he masked exhaustion with charm. Those close to him spoke of his ability to compartmentalize, to separate the man in agony from the president in command. At home, the White House became both sanctuary and stage. Jackie transformed it into a place of culture and beauty, restoring its historic rooms and filling them with art, music, and diplomacy. Her refinement gave the presidency an aura of sophistication unseen before. State dinners felt like scenes from a European court, yet behind the glamour lay an unspoken melancholy. The couple had endured immense personal loss: the stillbirth of a daughter, the death of their newborn son Patrick in 1963, tragedies that deepened their bond even as they tested it. In private moments, they shared quiet grief, away from the cameras that never stopped watching. Kennedy's dual life, between strength and fragility, duty and desire, gave his character a depth that few understood at the time. He could inspire millions with his words, yet privately wrestle with despair and isolation. He had everything the world could offer: fame, power, and admiration, yet he remained haunted by an awareness of how temporary it all was. Perhaps it was that awareness that drove him so relentlessly. Knowing his body was failing, he seemed determined to live as though time itself were an adversary to be defeated. Friends and aides often remarked that Kennedy lived in the present more intensely than anyone they knew. He could compartmentalize his pain, focus entirely on the moment, and then move forward with unshakable grace. That capacity, to project vitality while concealing vulnerability, became both his strength and his burden. The public adored the myth of JFK, the youthful president on his sailboat, the elegant family framed by sunlight and optimism. Few imagined that behind that image was a man constantly at war with his own body, seeking moments of peace amid perpetual pain. In the end, Kennedy's humanity was inseparable from his contradictions. The same discipline that kept his illnesses hidden allowed him to face crises with calm. The same appetite for risk that fueled his private indiscretions drove his political courage. He lived on the edge, physically, emotionally, and historically, never allowing the world to glimpse just how much effort it took to appear effortless. And so the legend grew. To the public, he remained the golden figure of American promise, radiant and untouchable. But those who truly knew him understood that behind every smile was endurance, behind every triumph, a private cost. It was this tension between the myth and the man that made John F. Kennedy not just a symbol of his time, but a deeply human figure whose struggles mirrored the very ideals he sought to inspire. By the early 1960s, the promise of Kennedy's new frontier had captured the imagination of the world. But at home, a different battle was intensifying, one that tested not just his political skill, but his conscience. The struggle for civil rights had reached a boiling point. Across the American South, segregation, voter suppression, and racial violence were being challenged by a rising movement that demanded equality, justice, and dignity. Kennedy, though sympathetic, had entered office cautiously. He understood the moral weight of the issue, yet feared that confronting it head-on could fracture his fragile political coalition. Still, as the tide of history swelled around him, the president who once balanced pragmatism against principle began to see that leadership demanded more than strategy. It demanded moral courage. When Kennedy took office in 1961, his administration's approach to civil rights was measured, almost hesitant. He had won the presidency by a narrow margin, relying on the support of both Northern liberals and Southern conservatives. To push too hard, too fast, he risked alienating powerful Southern Democrats who dominated Congress. His initial focus was on foreign policy and the Cold War. Racial issues, though pressing, were treated as domestic distractions that could derail his legislative goals. Yet events in the streets soon forced his hand. The Freedom Rides of 1961 brought national attention to the violence faced by Black Americans who dared challenge segregation in public transportation. Images of buses set ablaze and protesters beaten by mobs spread across newspapers and television screens. Kennedy, still navigating international crises, worried these images would damage America's reputation abroad, especially in the eyes of newly independent nations in Africa and Asia. He dispatched federal marshals to protect the riders, but his response was cautious, more concerned with order than with justice. To many activists, Kennedy seemed distant, unwilling to risk political capital for a cause that required not caution, but conviction. Behind the scenes, however, something was changing. Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General and his closest advisor, began pressing for stronger action. The brothers understood the moral gravity of what was unfolding, even if their instincts remained pragmatic. Then came 1962, when James Meredith, a young Black Air Force veteran, sought to enroll at the all-white University of Mississippi. The state's governor vowed to defy federal orders, and riots erupted on campus. 2 people were killed and hundreds injured. Kennedy responded decisively, sending in federal troops to restore order and ensure Meredith's admission. It was a turning point. For the first time, Kennedy used federal power to enforce civil rights. The crisis in Mississippi revealed to Kennedy the depth of the nation's racial divide. He saw firsthand the hatred, the defiance, and the human suffering that lay beneath polite political rhetoric. His tone began to shift. No longer could he treat civil rights as a secondary issue. It had become the defining moral question of his time. By 1963, that question could no longer be postponed. Protests in Birmingham, Alabama, led by Martin Luther King Jr., confronted the nation with images too shocking to ignore. Children attacked by police dogs, peaceful marchers blasted with fire hoses, and demonstrators thrown into jail for daring to demand equality. Kennedy watched the footage in the Oval Office, silent and shaken. That night, he told his aides that the movement's cause had become inseparable from America's identity. On June 11, 1963, Kennedy addressed the nation in one of the most powerful speeches of his presidency. Speaking directly to the American people, he declared civil rights a moral issue, as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. It was a stunning moment, the transformation of a cautious politician into a moral leader. He called for comprehensive civil rights legislation, stating that the time had come for America to live up to its own ideals. "We are confronted primarily with a moral issue," he said. "It is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities." Those words marked the beginning of a new chapter in Kennedy's presidency and in his own awakening. He no longer framed civil rights as a matter of law or politics, but of conscience. His call for legislation laid the groundwork for what would later become the Civil Rights Act of 1964, signed after his death. But in that moment, Kennedy had done more than propose a bill. He had claimed the moral high ground, aligning the presidency with the pursuit of justice. Later that summer, hundreds of thousands gathered in Washington for the historic March for Jobs and Freedom. Though Kennedy had initially been wary of the demonstration, fearing violence, he ultimately supported it. From the White House, he watched as Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his immortal "I Have a Dream" speech. Afterward, Kennedy invited King and other leaders to meet with him. In that meeting, King spoke of a dream. Kennedy, in turn, spoke of determination. He knew the battle ahead in Congress would be brutal, but his resolve was clear. Privately, Kennedy's aides noticed a change in him. The idealism that had once seemed abstract was now personal. His encounters with activists, ministers, and ordinary citizens had humanized the issue beyond politics. He spoke often of his desire for America to be remembered not just for its power, but for its compassion. The man who had once viewed civil rights through the lens of strategy now saw it as the test of the nation's soul and of his own presidency. In his final months, Kennedy carried this conviction with quiet urgency. He toured the South, aware of the hostility that awaited him, yet determined to bridge divisions. When he spoke to audiences in Texas just days before his death, he emphasized unity, a theme that had come to define his final year. The president who began his term focused on the Cold War ended it focused on the moral war within his own country. For Kennedy, civil rights became more than a political issue. It was a mirror of his evolution as a leader and as a man. The cautious strategist had become the moral statesman, willing to risk popularity for principle. And though his life would end before the struggle reached its victory, his words had already shifted the national conscience. In facing the question of equality, John F. Kennedy had not only helped transform America, he had in his final year transformed himself. The morning of November 22, 1963, began with sunlight over Dallas, a city alive with expectation. Crowds gathered along the motorcade route, eager to catch a glimpse of the young president whose charisma had captivated a nation. John F. Kennedy had come to Texas to heal political divisions within the Democratic Party, to strengthen support ahead of the next election. The trip was meant to be routine, a day of speeches, smiles, and handshakes, but within hours it would become one of the darkest days in American history. Air Force One touched down at Love Field just before noon. Kennedy and Jacqueline stepped off the plane to warm applause. She wore a pink Chanel suit, radiant against the autumn sky, the perfect image of optimism. The president greeted officials, shook hands with supporters, and then climbed into the open-top 1961 Lincoln Continental that would carry him through the city streets. Governor John Connally and his wife rode ahead of them. The atmosphere was festive, a sea of waving flags cheering families and the hum of camera shutters. No one imagined that history was quietly positioning itself for tragedy. As the motorcade wound through downtown Dallas, the president was at ease. He waved to the crowds, exchanging smiles with Jackie beside him. They turned onto Elm Street, entering Dealey Plaza, a modest stretch of buildings, bridges, and open space. The car slowed slightly as it passed the Texas School Book Depository. At 12:30 p.m., the world changed in an instant. The first shot rang out, sharp, distant, confusing. Some thought it was a motorcycle backfire. Then came another. In a fraction of a second, chaos replaced celebration. The president's hands flew to his throat. Jacqueline turned toward him. her face frozen in disbelief. A third shot shattered the air, striking Kennedy in the head. The force threw him backward, a crimson burst staining his collar. Jackie, in a moment of shock and instinct, climbed onto the rear of the car, reaching toward the back, as Secret Service agent Clint Hill leapt aboard, pushing her back into the seat as the driver accelerated toward Parkland Memorial Hospital. Within minutes, the jubilant crowds had dissolved into panic. Radios crackled with confusion. Reporters shouted into phones, their voices breaking with disbelief. At 1:00 p.m., doctors at Parkland pronounced John Fitzgerald Kennedy dead. The news swept through the nation like a wave of grief and paralysis. Television anchors struggled to speak. Across America, people wept openly in homes, schools, and offices. The unthinkable had happened. A young, hopeful president struck down in the prime of life, before the eyes of his wife and an entire generation. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in aboard Air Force One at 2:38 p.m., beside a stunned Jacqueline Kennedy still wearing her blood-stained suit. When asked if she wanted to change before the ceremony, she refused, saying quietly, "I want them to see what they've done to Jack." The plane lifted off for Washington, carrying both the new president and the lifeless body of the one who had just become history. The nation entered a period of mourning unlike any it had ever known. Kennedy's funeral, modeled after Lincoln's, was a somber procession through Washington. The riderless horse, the muffled drums, the flag-draped casket resting in the Capitol rotunda as thousands filed past in silence. The image of little John Jr. saluting his father's coffin became an eternal symbol of innocence amid loss. In those few days, the country united in grief, and the legend of John F. Kennedy was born. But even as the world mourned, questions began to spread. Within hours of the assassination, police had arrested Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine with ties to both the Soviet Union and Cuba. The official story was that he acted alone, firing 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. Yet from the beginning, many found the explanation too neat, too convenient. The speed of the shots, the angle of the wounds, the strange behavior of Oswald, it all fueled suspicion. 2 days later, before Oswald could stand trial, he was shot and killed on live television by nightclub owner Jack Ruby in the basement of the Dallas Police Headquarters. The act, broadcast to millions, deepened the mystery. What had seemed like justice now looked like a cover-up. Conspiracy theories flourished, involving the CIA, organized crime, Cuban exiles, and even elements within the government itself. In 1964, the Warren Commission concluded that Oswald had acted alone, but its findings did little to silence doubt. Over the decades, new evidence, testimonies, and documents would emerge, each offering more questions than answers. For many Americans, the truth of Dallas remained elusive, buried under layers of secrecy and speculation. But beyond the theories, one fact endured: the sense that something vital had been stolen, not just a leader, but a vision of what America might have become. Kennedy's death marked the end of post-war innocence. The optimism of the early 1960s gave way to cynicism, distrust, and unrest. The world seemed darker, heavier, as if the light that once illuminated the nation's sense of possibility had suddenly gone out. In the years that followed, Kennedy's image crystallized into myth. Photographs of his smile, his speeches, his family on the White House lawn. They all became relics of a lost era. His presidency, brief as it was, came to represent youth, idealism, and courage. The phrase Camelot, coined by Jackie in the months after his death, gave his life and leadership a near-legendary aura, a fleeting golden age, tragically interrupted. Dallas was more than a crime scene. It was a turning point in the American story. The shots that echoed through Dealey Plaza did not just end a presidency, they fractured a generation's faith in certainty. The man who had spoken of hope, peace, and possibility became a martyr to those very ideals. And from that day forward, John F. Kennedy would belong not only to history but to memory, suspended forever between fact and legend. John F. Kennedy's life was brief, but its impact on America and the world has proven enduring in ways few could have predicted. His death in Dallas did more than shock a nation. It froze a moment in history, transforming a young, ambitious president into a symbol of possibility, idealism, and unfinished promise. Kennedy's legacy is not measured solely in legislative achievements or foreign policy victories, though there were notable successes, but in the imagination he ignited. The idea that leadership could inspire, that a nation could strive toward its highest ideals, and that youth, vision, and moral courage mattered in the corridors of power. In the immediate years following his assassination, the mythology of Kennedy grew. Jackie Kennedy carefully curated the image of Camelot, emphasizing charm, intellect, and style over the messy realities of politics. Photographs of the First Family, the iconic speeches, and his elegant presence in public spaces were elevated to almost sacred status. Americans, still reeling from the shock of sudden loss, embraced a narrative of hope and potential interrupted, a golden age that existed only in memory and aspiration. Kennedy became not merely a historical figure, but a moral touchstone, a lens through which the nation could imagine what might have been. Politically, his influence shaped generations. His advocacy for civil rights, once cautious and calculated, set the stage for legislation passed after his death, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Young Americans, inspired by his speeches and vision, entered public service in unprecedented numbers, fueled by the belief that one could combine intellect, idealism, and action to reshape society. The Peace Corps, a creation of his administration, became a living symbol of global engagement and humanitarian commitment, demonstrating that Kennedy's vision extended beyond domestic politics into the wider world. Kennedy's approach to leadership, blending charisma, empathy, and a willingness to take calculated risks, set a new standard for presidents in the television era. His mastery of media, particularly televised speeches and public appearances, forever changed political communication. Candidates after him recognized that presence, image, and style were inseparable from substance, that the lens through which leaders are seen could amplify, distort, or even define their policies. In this sense, Kennedy was not just a president, but a template for modern political narrative. Yet beyond the political and symbolic, Kennedy's legacy is profoundly human. He embodied the contradictions of aspiration and limitation, ambition and vulnerability. Chronic illness, private fears, and personal flaws coexisted with public courage, eloquence, and moral imagination. In these contrasts lies the enduring fascination with his life, a man who seemed larger than life precisely because he straddled both the mythic and the real. Generations have been drawn to that tension, a hero who struggled, a leader who suffered, a man whose potential was never fully realized, but whose example continues to inspire. In cultural terms, Kennedy's presidency shaped how Americans perceive possibility itself. The image of the young president looking confidently toward the horizon, speaking of service, unity, and progress, became a standard against which hope is measured. The very notion that youth could hold the highest office, that intellect and charm could influence international diplomacy, and that leadership required both courage and reflection, was crystallized in his tenure. Even decades later, politicians, journalists, and citizens invoke Kennedy as a benchmark for idealism and moral authority, a figure who represents not just what was, but what might be. The mythology of Kennedy also raises questions about mortality, memory, and the fragility of ambition. His assassination froze his story at a point of potential rather than decline. Americans mourned not only his death but the possibilities he represented, the policies he might have enacted, the social divisions he might have healed, the global crises he might have approached with creativity and restraint. That sense of what could have been adds a poignancy to his story, intensifying the fascination and devotion his life continues to inspire. Yet perhaps the most enduring lesson of Kennedy's life is the tension between idealism and pragmatism, vision and reality. He understood that leadership required courage, both moral and political. He showed that the act of governing could be a reflection of conscience, that public service could be more than management. It could be inspiration. The enduring power of his legacy lies in this challenge to each generation. to measure their own possibilities against the standard of engagement, empathy, and courage he embodied. Even today, over half a century after his death, John F. Kennedy's influence is present in politics, media, culture, and collective memory. His words, images, and actions continue to define the American imagination. He represents a promise that leadership is not merely the execution of policy, but the embodiment of ideals. That even in imperfection and vulnerability, one can inspire a nation to believe in something larger than itself. The story of JFK endures because it reminds us that history is not only about what has been done, but about what could be achieved when vision, courage, and humanity converge in a single individual. Ultimately, Kennedy's legacy is a mirror for the nation, a reflection of its hopes, its struggles, and its capacity for renewal. He reminds us that leadership is as much about character as it is about accomplishment, and that the measure of a president is often in the inspiration he leaves behind, rather than the years he occupies the office. The myth of John F. Kennedy may be gilded, but at its core lies a truth timeless and powerful, that one life, fully lived, can continue to shape generations, challenge complacency, and ignite the imagination of a nation long after its final chapter has been written.